In the gleaming glass atrium of Rothtech Corporation, Caleb Monroe crouched beside the elevator bank with his weathered mop bucket. His 39-year-old frame moved with practiced efficiency as he cleaned scuff marks from the pristine marble floor. When the elevator doors whispered open, a 7-year-old girl in a navy dress burst through the crowd, clutching a worn purple backpack. She ran straight to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist, and shouted the words that would shatter two carefully constructed worlds. "Daddy." The bustling atrium fell into stunned silence. From the executive corridor, Vivien Roth emerged in her ice-blue blazer, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. The little girl turned toward her mother and declared to the gathering crowd, "He's my real dad." 3 people stood at the epicenter of this earthquake, each representing a different world within the same gleaming corporate tower. Caleb Monroe, the maintenance worker, who had applied for this position 8 months ago under circumstances he had never explained to anyone, lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment 23 minutes away with his elderly roommate Frank, a former construction worker who asked no questions about Caleb's frequent silences, or the way he sometimes stared at photographs hidden in his dresser drawer for hours at a time. Caleb's hands told the complete story of his working-class life, permanently scarred from 15 years of engine work, calloused from countless tools, but surprisingly gentle when they needed to be, as his coworkers had occasionally witnessed when he helped elderly visitors navigate the building's revolving doors or assisted delivery drivers with heavy packages without being asked and always disappearing before being thanked. He had been an automotive mechanic for most of his adult life before this unexpected career change, fixing other people's mechanical problems with the kind of quiet competence that earned trust but never recognition, never imagining his own life would eventually lead him to pushing an industrial mop cart through the pristine corridors of one of America's most successful technology corporations. His fellow maintenance workers knew him as utterly reliable, always the first to arrive each morning at 5:30 and frequently the last to leave each evening, the kind of man who would volunteer for double shifts during holidays so that colleagues with families could spend time at home, though he never spoke about whether he had family of his own waiting for him anywhere. What none of them knew was that every single morning when he entered Rothtech's imposing marble lobby through the service entrance, his chest tightened with a complex mixture of desperate hope and nauseating terror, knowing that somewhere within this 35-story monument to corporate success was the one person he had been systematically prevented from seeing for 7 agonizing years. Vivien Roth commanded the 35th floor of the Rothtech building with the effortless authority of someone who had been born into privilege but had earned her position through a combination of Harvard-educated brilliance and the kind of strategic thinking that could transform inherited wealth into genuine power. At 35 years old, she had taken her family's moderately successful software company and transformed it into a technology empire worth over $2 billion, her photograph appearing on the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines as an example of visionary leadership in an industry still dominated by men twice her age with half her intelligence. She wore her unprecedented success like carefully tailored armor, the perfectly pressed designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, the measured tone of voice that could silence a boardroom full of aggressive investors, the reputation for being demanding but fair that had earned her grudging respect from competitors who would have preferred to dismiss her as another trust fund child playing at being a businesswoman. Her corner office overlooked downtown Boston like a throne room, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that reminded everyone who entered of exactly how high she had climbed from her starting point, though few people knew that her true starting point had been considerably more humble than her current biography suggested. Success had required sacrifices that she had learned to reframe as strategic choices, chief among them the careful construction of a personal life that appeared flawless from every possible angle of public scrutiny. Single motherhood had been transformed through expert public relations into a narrative of empowerment and independence, her daughter Lily presented to the business world and society pages as the product of a brief but passionate relationship with a European businessman who had tragically died in a skiing accident before the child's birth. The story was clean, sympathetic, completely believable, and entirely fabricated from beginning to end. What the cameras and reporters and board members didn't see were the nights when Vivien would stand at her bedroom window in her Beacon Hill townhouse, staring out at the city lights that represented her kingdom, wondering whether the choices she had made in the name of protecting her daughter's future had actually been elaborate justifications for protecting her own carefully constructed image. Lily Roth possessed the unsettling perceptive abilities that sometimes develop in children who have learned to read the spaces between spoken words, the meaningful silences that adults create when they're protecting secrets they believe are too complicated for young minds to understand. She was 7 years old chronologically, but carried herself with the quiet observational skills of someone much older, her dark eyes taking in details that adults assumed she wouldn't notice or remember or find significant enough to question later. While other children her age were completely absorbed in animated movies and playground politics and the simple social dynamics of elementary school, Lily found herself mysteriously drawn to the margins of her mother's corporate world, fascinated by the security guards who worked overnight shifts, the cleaning staff who arrived before dawn to prepare the building for another day of important business, the invisible army of working-class people who kept her mother's pristine environment functioning smoothly. She had developed an unusual habit of sketching during the interminable board meetings that her mother sometimes brought her to when childcare arrangements fell through, her small hands moving across paper with surprising artistic skill, while executives in expensive suits discussed quarterly projections and market expansion strategies and merger possibilities that meant nothing to her but seemed to generate enormous excitement among the adults. Her drawings invariably featured the same mysterious recurring character, a man with brown hair wearing some kind of cap, usually holding a wrench or standing beside an automobile, sometimes appearing in what looked like a garage or workshop setting. When teachers or babysitters or family friends asked about these persistent figures in her artwork, she would simply explain that they were people from her dreams, though her tone of voice suggested she believed them to be something more substantial and significant than mere imagination. Lily had never questioned why she didn't have a father present in her daily life, accepting her mother's carefully crafted explanation about the European businessman with the same trust that children naturally reserve for the adults who shape their understanding of how the world operates. But recently, something had been stirring in her consciousness that she lacked the vocabulary to articulate, a restless feeling that important pieces of her personal story were missing, that the official version of her family history contained gaps that didn't quite make sense when she examined them with the logical thinking she had apparently inherited from both sides of her genetic heritage. The feeling had intensified over the past several months, coinciding with her increased exposure to her mother's workplace, and the growing sense that answers to questions she didn't know how to ask might be hidden somewhere within the familiar corridors of Roth-Tech's imposing corporate headquarters. The security footage from that transformative afternoon would later show Lily breaking away from her mother's assistant near the main elevator bank, her purple backpack bouncing against her small frame as she ran toward the maintenance area with the kind of unmistakable sense of purpose that suggested weeks or possibly months of careful observation and planning. But what the high-definition cameras positioned throughout the building couldn't capture was the moment of recognition that had first sparked in her chest 3 weeks earlier when she had spotted Caleb Monroe replacing fluorescent light bulbs in the main lobby, the inexplicable but absolutely certain feeling that this quiet man with gentle movements and tired eyes was connected to her in ways that defied every logical explanation she had been taught to accept about her family's structure and history. She had been visiting the office with her mother that day, bored by yet another round of meetings that seemed to consist entirely of adults talking very seriously about numbers and percentages and strategic initiatives that meant nothing to her 7-year-old understanding of the back world, when she had noticed him working near the information desk. Something about the careful, methodical way he approached his tasks, the unconscious kindness in his movements when he had stopped his work to help an elderly visitor navigate the building's intimidating revolving door system, had made her stop whatever she was doing and stare at him with an intensity that probably should have made him uncomfortable but instead seemed to amuse him slightly. When he had noticed her watching and had offered a small, hesitant smile that somehow seemed both completely natural and slightly nervous, Lily had felt a jolt of familiarity so powerful and unexpected that it had made her momentarily dizzy, as if she had suddenly recognized someone she had been looking for her entire life without realizing she was searching. The days that followed had been consumed by her new obsession with finding excuses to linger in areas of the building where Caleb might appear during his daily rounds, studying his face from across crowded lobbies and trying to solve a puzzle that her 7-year-old mind couldn't quite articulate, but absolutely refused to abandon. 3 days after the scene in the atrium that had changed everything for everyone involved, Vivien found herself standing in her daughter's bedroom doorway at 2:17 in the morning, watching Lily sleep peacefully and trying to understand how her carefully constructed world had collapsed so completely and so quickly. The past 72 hours had been an intensive crash course in crisis management of a type that no business school had prepared her for: emergency damage control sessions with the board of directors, strategic conversations with key shareholders and investors, increasingly tense discussions with her head of corporate security about how a maintenance worker had somehow gained access to proprietary areas of the building and personal information about her family, and a series of heated conference calls with lawyers and public relations specialists who specialized in containing scandals before they could metastasize into something that might permanently damage her company's reputation and stock price. But beneath all the professional crisis management and corporate damage control lay a deeper, more personal reckoning that Vivien had been successfully avoiding for 7 years through a combination of willful denial, strategic amnesia, and the kind of psychological compartmentalization that high-achieving people often develop to protect themselves from inconvenient emotional truths. She moved quietly across Lily's bedroom and approached the small desk where dozens of drawings were scattered across the surface like pieces of evidence in a case she had never wanted anyone to solve, least of all herself. The recurring figure in her daughter's artwork was no longer an abstract mystery that could be dismissed as childhood imagination. The brown hair, the gentle facial expression, even the particular way he held his shoulders, all matched the man who now mopped floors 23 stories below her executive office. With hands that trembled slightly despite her attempts to maintain emotional control, Vivien gathered the sketches one by one, studying each drawing for clues about what her daughter had somehow intuited or discovered that she herself had spent years and considerable amounts of money trying to forget completely. The artistic progression was unmistakable. Early drawings showed a vague male figure that could have been anyone, but the more recent sketches displayed increasingly specific details that matched Caleb's actual appearance with an accuracy that couldn't possibly be coincidental. Somehow, through methods that Vivien couldn't begin to understand, Lily had been unconsciously searching for and eventually finding the father who had been systematically erased from her official existence. The walk from Lily's bedroom to her own master suite felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the growing certainty of what she would be forced to confront when she opened the hidden compartment in her walk-in closet that had remained sealed for nearly 3 years. Behind designer shoes that cost more than most people's monthly car payments and carefully organized collections of handbags from Italian designers, wrapped in silk scarves that still carried faint traces of the drugstore perfume she had worn in college when she was young and idealistic, was a small wooden jewelry box that contained the physical evidence of the life she had abandoned when she had chosen respectability over authenticity. 23 letters, written in Caleb's careful, precise handwriting on lined notebook paper, spanning the first 2 years after Lily's birth, and documenting his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain some kind of connection with the daughter he had been legally prevented from acknowledging. Photographs of them together during their brief, impossible romance showed a girl who looked nothing like the polished corporate executive she had eventually become, someone who wore thrift store clothing and laughed without considering how the sound might affect her professional reputation. A copy of Lily's original birth certificate with Caleb's name carefully covered with correction fluid and replaced with the words "Father Unknown," a decision that had felt necessary and protective at the time, but now seemed like an act of vandalism against her own heart and her daughter's fundamental right to know where she had come from. The letters told a story of desperate love constrained by circumstances that seemed designed to make genuine connection impossible, documenting a young man's attempts to navigate the fortress of lawyers and private security guards and legal restraining orders that Vivien's family had systematically constructed around her during her pregnancy. His words grew more plaintive and desperate with each unanswered envelope. "I just want to know if she's healthy and happy. I don't need to be part of her daily life, but please let me know that she exists and that she's okay." The tone gradually shifted from hopeful to resigned as months passed without any response, but the underlying love and concern never wavered, never became bitter or demanding, never transformed into the kind of angry threats that might have justified the extreme measures that had been taken to keep him away. The final letter, dated exactly 3 months after Lily's second birthday, was different in tone from all the others: resigned but not bitter, understanding but not defeated, written by someone who had clearly reached the end of his emotional resources, but refused to let his exhaustion transform into resentment. The emergency board meeting had been Vivien's idea, a preemptive strike designed to control the narrative and manage the potential damage before rumors and speculation could spread beyond the confines of RothTech's corporate headquarters and metastasize into something that might permanently affect her company's reputation, stock price, and her own position as chief executive officer. She sat at the head of the polished mahogany conference table, surrounded by 12 of the most powerful and influential people in American technology, and prepared to deploy the same strategic thinking and persuasive abilities that had built her empire and earned her recognition as one of the most effective leaders of her generation. The story she had prepared was clinical and strategic, stripped of emotional complications that might cloud her board's judgment or create unnecessary sympathy for anyone involved in the situation. She presented the facts as she wanted them understood. An unstable employee had somehow gained access to personal information about her family and was using her daughter to create disruption within the company, possibly as part of some elaborate blackmail scheme or attempt to extract financial compensation for imagined grievances. The solution she proposed was swift and decisive, immediate termination of the employee in question, enhanced security protocols throughout the building, comprehensive background checks for all current and future maintenance staff, and a carefully crafted press release that would frame the entire incident as a cautionary tale about corporate vulnerability, rather than personal drama that might invite unwanted scrutiny of her private life. For 27 minutes, she watched heads nod in agreement around the conference table, listened to murmurs of support for her decisive leadership and practical approach to crisis management, and felt the familiar satisfaction that came from watching a complex problem resolve itself through the strategic application of money, influence, and professional expertise. Until Harold Weinstock, the company's longest-serving board member and her late father's oldest friend, leaned back in his leather chair and asked the question that would change everything. "Vivien, dear, why does a 7-year-old girl think that a janitor is her father?" The silence that followed was qualitatively different from the stunned quiet that had filled the corporate atrium 3 days earlier. This was the silence of people who had suddenly realized they were participants in something far more significant and emotionally complex than a routine corporate crisis. Harold removed his reading glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture she remembered from childhood whenever he was processing information that challenged his understanding of the world. "And you never told us this because?" The question was gentle but implacable, carrying the weight of 7 years' worth of decisions that would now have to be explained and justified to people who had trusted her with their investments and their faith in her judgment. The Human Resources Office on the 15th floor had hosted thousands of conversations over the years, but nothing in the company's corporate history had prepared the sterile conference room for a conversation quite like this one. Vivien sat across from Caleb at the rectangular table where she had conducted hundreds of similar meetings, but every familiar element of the corporate environment seemed transformed by the presence of emotions and personal history that had no place in the carefully regulated world of employee relations and professional boundaries. She had spent nearly 2 hours preparing for this confrontation, rehearsing the authoritative tone that would establish clear expectations and protect both her family and her company from further disruption, practicing the kind of controlled corporate language that could turn the most complex human situations into manageable business problems with clearly defined solutions and measurable outcomes. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as they rested quietly on the table between them, still permanently marked by years of automotive work, calloused and scarred in ways that expensive manicures and corporate desk jobs could never completely erase, but undeniably gentle in their stillness. She remembered with unwanted clarity how those same hands had once traced her face in the dim light of his studio apartment during the brief period when she had believed that love could transcend the differences in their backgrounds, social expectations. When she finally managed to speak, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of her executive position, but lacked the usual certainty that had made her famous for her decisive leadership style. "I need to understand what you want from this situation," she said, the words emerging more as a genuine question than as the statement of corporate policy she had intended to deliver. Caleb met her eyes directly for the first time since the scene in the atrium 3 days earlier, and she saw reflected in them the same complex mixture of love, pain, hope, and resignation that had haunted her dreams for 7 years. I want exactly what I've always wanted, he replied quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had spent years thinking about this moment and had long since made peace with the limitations of what was possible. To know that she's happy and safe and loved. Everything else is just noise that doesn't matter. The simplicity of his answer was somehow more devastating than any demand or threat or legal challenge could have been, stripping away all the layers of corporate complexity and legal maneuvering she had built around this moment and reducing it to its most essential truth. A father who had been separated from his child by circumstances beyond his control, and a mother who had allowed it to happen. Lily's disappearance was officially discovered at 8:47 on a Thursday evening in early October, when Vivien's housekeeper knocked on the child's bedroom door to remind her about bath time and found the room empty except for a hand-drawn map spread across the desk with the careful attention to detail that suggested weeks of systematic observation and methodical planning. The crude but surprisingly accurate sketch showed the route from their Beacon Hill townhouse to the Rothtech building, complete with detailed notations about bus stops and crosswalk timing, and the locations of security cameras that a 7-year-old had somehow noticed and cataloged during their regular trips to the office. A note written in Lily's careful second-grade handwriting explained her logic with the kind of devastating clarity that only children possess when they decide to solve adult problems through direct action. Mom said Caleb can't come to our house because it would be too complicated, so I have to go find him at his work. Don't be scared. I know exactly how to get there, and I have enough money for the bus, and I promise to be careful. The next 3 hours and 17 minutes became a blur of police reports, emergency phone calls, security alerts, and the kind of coordinated search effort that money and political influence could mobilize within minutes of a crisis being declared. Patrol cars swept through downtown Boston while helicopters equipped with searchlights circled the city, and every major transportation hub was flooded with officers carrying Lily's school photograph and detailed descriptions of what she had been wearing when she disappeared. Vivien found herself in the surreal position of coordinating a massive law enforcement operation while simultaneously trying to explain to police detectives why her daughter might have been attempting to locate a maintenance worker, a conversation that required her to reveal more about her personal history than she had shared with anyone in 7 years, including details that she had never expected to discuss with strangers who were taking notes that would become part of an official record. But while helicopters circled overhead and patrol cars combed through every neighborhood between Beacon Hill and the financial district, Lily was exactly where her carefully written note had promised she would be, sitting in the Rothtech building's maintenance break room in the basement level, sharing a cup of hot chocolate with the man she had claimed as her father, and looking remarkably calm for someone who had just executed the most important mission of her 7-year-old life. Frank, Caleb's 73-year-old roommate and closest friend, had driven him back to the office building when the night security supervisor had called to report a situation involving a child who had somehow gained access to restricted areas of the building, and both men had found Lily waiting patiently beside Caleb's employee locker, her purple backpack neatly positioned beside her feet, and her expression radiating the kind of serene satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a difficult task that everyone else had insisted was impossible. When Vivien finally arrived at the building, flanked by police officers and her head of corporate security, she found Lily curled up comfortably in Caleb's arms on the break room's battered couch, both of them surrounded by the harsh institutional fluorescent lighting that somehow made everything in the room look sterile and unwelcoming, except for the profound sense of peace and contentment on her daughter's face. Caleb had been reading to her from a children's book that Frank had retrieved from his truck, a story about a lost puppy who overcomes various obstacles to find its way home to the family that had been searching for it, and Lily's eyes were heavy with the drowsy trust that comes from finally feeling completely safe after a long period of uncertainty and anxiety. The sight hit Vivien with the force of a physical blow, not because it was wrong or inappropriate or dangerous, but because it was so obviously right and natural and necessary that she wondered how she had managed to convince herself for 7 years that its absence was acceptable or sustainable. The morning after Lily's unauthorized adventure brought an emergency staff meeting that would eventually become part of Rothtech corporate legend, discussed in business schools and featured in case studies about crisis management and the intersection of personal and professional responsibilities in modern corporate environments. Vivien had called the meeting ostensibly to address serious security concerns and reinforce protocols about unauthorized access to company facilities. But everyone who packed into the main conference room on the third floor sensed that something more significant and emotionally complex was unfolding than a routine discussion of workplace safety measures. She stood at the front of the room where she had delivered countless presentations about quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives, her usual commanding presence, somehow both more vulnerable and more genuinely powerful than anyone had ever seen it, and began with an apology that no one in the audience had expected to hear from someone whose leadership style was famous for its confidence and decisive authority. "I owe all of you an explanation," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room where Caleb stood beside the maintenance supervisor, his presence officially acknowledged for the first time in the 8 months he had worked for the company. "And I owe someone in this room something much more important than an explanation." The story she told was stripped of the careful euphemisms and strategic omissions that had protected her reputation and privacy for 7 years, rendered in the kind of direct, honest language that she had never used in a professional context because it made her vulnerable in ways that successful executives were taught to avoid at all costs. She spoke about falling in love as a college student with someone her family considered inappropriate, about the social pressure and economic realities that had made their relationship seem impossible to sustain, about the cowardice and fear that had allowed her to let other people make decisions that should have been hers alone to make. When she finished speaking, the room remained silent until Margaret Chen from the accounting department raised her hand with the nervous energy of someone who was about to say something either very brave or very foolish. "So what happens now?" she asked. And Vivien realized that for the first time in her entire professional career, she genuinely didn't know the answer. The legal documents that would formally restore Caleb's parental rights took 6 weeks and 3 days to process through the Massachusetts family court system, but the emotional recognition that mattered most to everyone involved happened in an instant that surprised all three of them with its profound simplicity and lack of dramatic ceremony. Vivien had expected the conversations with her family law attorneys to be complicated and contentious, filled with custody negotiations and financial arrangements, and detailed agreements that would protect everyone's interests while maintaining appropriate boundaries and ensuring that her daughter's welfare remained the primary consideration in all decisions. Instead, she found herself sitting across from Caleb in yet another sterile conference room, this time in a downtown law office that specialized in family cases, with a stack of official papers that would legally acknowledge what had always been biologically true, but had been systematically denied for 7 years. When she slid the completed forms across the polished table, her signature already drying on lines that officially recognized him as Lily's biological father and restored his legal rights to participate in decisions about her education, medical care, and general welfare, she watched his face transform with an emotion so complex and overwhelming that it couldn't be captured by any single word in the English language. "This doesn't change everything immediately," she heard herself explaining, though she wasn't entirely sure whether she was trying to convince him or herself or the lawyers who were witnessing this unprecedented reversal of a legal situation that had seemed permanently settled. "We'll still need time to figure out practical arrangements, custody schedules, financial responsibilities, all the logistics that come with co-parenting a child who doesn't really understand why her family's situation has been so complicated for her entire life." Caleb picked up the legal documents with the kind of reverence that someone might show to sacred religious texts, his eyes scanning the official language that finally, formally, permanently connected him to his daughter. "Thank you," he said simply. And Vivien realized that in all their years apart, she had never once heard him sound bitter or angry or resentful, only patient and grateful for whatever small opportunities for connection he was occasionally allowed to have. The process of becoming a functional family unit was nothing like the romanticized versions that movies and television shows had taught any of them to expect from dramatic reunions and emotional reconciliations. There were no magical montages of instant bonding, no soundtrack-worthy moments that erased 7 years of separation and complicated feelings through the simple power of shared DNA and good intentions. Instead, there were awkward dinners where all three of them tried too hard to find common conversational ground, bedtime routines that had to be carefully negotiated between two adults who had very different ideas about appropriate parenting strategies, and approximately 1,000 small daily adjustments that proved more challenging and emotionally exhausting than any of them had anticipated when they had imagined how this reunion might unfold in their most optimistic moments. Caleb moved from his cramped apartment into a modest two-bedroom house in a neighborhood closer to Lily's elementary school, spending most of his savings on furniture and child-appropriate decorations, and trying to create a living space that would feel welcoming and comfortable to a daughter who was still learning what it meant to have a father who was present in her daily life, rather than existing only in dreams and imagination. Vivien found herself relearning how to share decision-making authority about Lily's schedule, education, social activities, and general welfare, consulting with someone whose judgment she trusted, but whose methods and priorities were often completely different from her own, carefully researched approaches to child development and academic achievement. But slowly, through patience and the kind of awkward honesty that functional families require when they're learning to navigate relationships that don't fit conventional social models, they began to find their unique rhythm and develop traditions that belonged specifically to them. The annual RothTech Charity Gala had always been Vivien's favorite corporate event, a carefully orchestrated evening that successfully combined business networking with genuine philanthropy, while showcasing the company's commitment to community engagement and social responsibility. This year's beneficiary was a literacy program for underprivileged children throughout the greater Boston area, and Lily had been invited to present awards to local teachers who had made exceptional contributions to their students' educational development, despite working in schools with limited resources and challenging circumstances. As the evening's formal program reached its carefully planned climax, 7-year-old Lily took the stage with the kind of natural poise that suggested she had inherited performance confidence from both sides of her genetic heritage. Her navy blue dress, elegant but appropriately childlike, her smile genuine and unforced as she looked out at the assembled crowd of Boston's most influential business leaders, philanthropists, and political figures. When the master of ceremonies asked Lily if she had anyone special she wanted to thank for helping her prepare for this important moment, she didn't hesitate or show any signs of the nervousness that might have been expected from someone her age, addressing such a distinguished audience. "My real dad," she announced clearly, her voice carrying through the wireless microphone with perfect clarity to every corner of the ballroom, "Mr. Caleb Monroe." The immediate silence that followed was qualitatively different from the shocked quiet that had filled RothTech's corporate atrium 2 months earlier, because this audience had no context for understanding what they were witnessing, no background knowledge that would help them interpret why a 7-year-old girl was publicly acknowledging a father whose existence had never been mentioned in any of the carefully crafted biographical profiles that had appeared in business magazines and society publications. Every head in the ballroom turned simultaneously to locate the man she was describing, their collective gaze eventually finding him at a table near the back of the room where he sat beside Frank, both men wearing the kind of uncomfortable formal clothing that suggested borrowed or hastily purchased garments that didn't quite fit properly, but represented their best attempt to meet the evening's dress code requirements. Caleb's face flushed deep red as 300 pairs of eyes focused on him with the intensity of people trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become personally relevant to their understanding of one of Boston's most prominent business leaders, his natural instinct clearly telling him to disappear into the background invisibility that had protected him throughout his adult life in corporate and social environments, where his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. But Lily wasn't finished with her public declaration. With the fearless certainty that had originally driven her to find him against all adult opposition and practical obstacles, she walked confidently to the edge of the stage and extended her small hand toward him in an invitation that was unmistakable in its meaning and impossible to refuse without causing a scene that would be far more dramatic than simply accepting her request. "Come up here, Daddy," she said, using the word that still felt revolutionary every time she spoke it aloud, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with the force of a fundamental declaration about family, love, and the courage required to claim relationships that society might not automatically understand or approve. "I want everyone to meet you properly." Caleb stood slowly from his chair, his hands visibly shaking as Frank whispered urgent encouragement beside him, and began what felt like the longest and most significant walk of his entire life toward the stage where his daughter waited with the patient confidence of someone who had never doubted that he would answer her call. Every step across the ballroom floor felt enormous and consequential, each footfall marking his transition from the shadows where he had lived for 7 years into the bright lights where Lily insisted he belonged. moving through a crowd of people whose wealth and social position had once seemed like insurmountable barriers to his participation in his daughter's life, but who now appeared to be simply curious observers of a family story that was more interesting and emotionally complex than anything that usually happened at corporate fundraising events. When he finally reached the stage, climbing the few steps with the careful movement of someone who was still adjusting to being the center of attention rather than its invisible support staff, Lily immediately grabbed his hand with both of hers and turned back toward the microphone with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been bothering her for most of her conscious life. "This is my dad," she announced to the crowd with a pride and certainty that seemed to fill the entire ballroom, her voice carrying all the love and determination that had driven her to reject every adult explanation about why her family couldn't be complete. "He fixes things when they're broken, and he makes everything better, and now he doesn't have to hide anymore because I found him and Mom remembered that she loves him too." The applause that followed started tentatively, with one person clapping uncertainly near the front of the ballroom, then spreading like ripples across water as the emotional authenticity of the moment overcame whatever social confusion or professional awkwardness the audience might have been feeling about witnessing such a personal family reunion in such a public setting. Within seconds, 300 people were on their feet in a standing ovation that celebrated not just the evening's charitable cause, but the courage of a little girl who had refused to accept that some broken things couldn't be repaired, some separated families couldn't be reunited, and some love stories couldn't find their way to happy endings despite the obstacles that seemed designed to prevent such outcomes. From her table near the front of the ballroom, Vivien watched her daughter and the man she had once loved stand together in the spotlight, both of them glowing with the kind of profound happiness that money couldn't purchase and corporate success couldn't manufacture. For the first time in 7 years, she felt the crushing weight of regret and self-doubt lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter and more sustainable than the defensive justifications she had used to explain her choices to herself and others. As the evening's formal program concluded and guests began making their way toward the exits, stopping to congratulate Lily on her presentation and to introduce themselves to Caleb with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested her public declaration had transformed him from an invisible employee into someone worthy of respect and someone worthy of respect. Attention, Lily bounded down from the stage with the energy of someone who had just accomplished the most important task of her lifetime. She threw her arms around both her parents simultaneously, creating a brief, imperfect, completely genuine moment of family connection that would become the foundation for everything that came after. "We did it," she whispered to both of them, though neither adult was entirely certain what specific achievement she was celebrating. They only knew that for the first time in any of their lives, the three of them were exactly where they belonged together in the light where everyone could see them, no longer afraid of what the world might think of their unconventional journey toward becoming the family that Lily had always known they were meant to be.